Hello and welcome to this ESCoE webinar, the Halloween edition, and greetings from the land of the Gadigal people in Sydney, Australia. It's coming up to midnight, and we want to get this webinar finished before it turns midnight on Halloween. We're fortunate to have Peter Levell talking to us today, and he's going to be talking on the very topical issue of cheapflation or inflation inequality. Peter is Associate Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. He's on the ONS Technical Panel on Consumer Price Statistics, and most importantly, he's a member of the ESCoE Executive Leadership Team. So over to you, Peter.
Yes, okay. Thanks very much, Kevin, and thanks to Sarah for organizing this seminar, and thanks to so many of you for coming to join and listen to today's presentation. I'll just share my screen, if I can figure out how. Here we go. Okay, yes, so today's topic is cheapflation, inflation inequality, and this is a paper that I co-wrote with Tao Chen, who's a PhD student at UCL and a research scholar at IFS, and Martin O'Connell, who's at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. So the background to this is we're thinking really about this recent period in 2021-2023, where inflation rates across rich countries rose to levels not seen for several decades, in the UK for around 40 years or more. And to take one example, between 2021 Q3 and 2022 Q3, the UK's CPI over this period rose by 17.5%. And the food component of that rose particularly quickly by 29%. So this led, as we know, to a significant squeeze in living standards across countries, and potentially had an enormous impact on inequality because consumption baskets people consume across the population differ, and so they're going to be affected by inflation in very different ways. We now know much more about this than we would have done before in response to previous crises, because statistical agencies, including the ONS, now increasingly publish separate inflation rates by income groups that's drawn from data using drawn from spending data taken from household budget surveys. So, for example, in the UK, we have the Living Cost and Food Survey, which is the basis of the household level inflation rates published by the Office for National Statistics. So this allows us to have to allow high and low income households, for example, to have different consumption baskets and to look at how the prices of those different consumption baskets evolve differently. For example, low income households might have higher budget shares for food and energy, and that's one reason to think, and one reason why they were affected more strongly by the price rises we saw over that period recently. But a limitation of these is that these budget surveys are they're quite detailed. They have a limited amount of detail, and so they don't take account of differences in price changes across products within quite narrowly defined spending categories. So, for example, we can see how much more the lower income households spend on bread relative to high income households as a proportion of their budgets. But what we don't see from this data is how much more they spend on value versions of bread versus premium versions of bread, which might have seen different price increases over this period. This became particularly salient over this period because quite early on in this period of rapidly rising price increases, campaigners and people with lived experience of these cost price increases were already sounding alarm that certain goods were seeing faster price increases than others. So in particular, Jack Monroe, the food campaigner, she tweeted out in a long thread of tweets examples of where she saw in her local supermarket the cheapest varieties of goods. So she gives examples here of rice and pasta. We're seeing particularly rapid price increases. So of course, this is a set of examples from one particular visit to one particular store. What's obviously of great interest is how prevalent this phenomenon was, how widespread it was, and what in quantitative terms did it mean for the inflation experiences of low versus high income households. Now, to study a question like that, what we're going to need is much more detailed data than is used typically to study these questions. So we need data that's going to track the individual price changes of individual products, and that we can link those products to the consumption baskets of different household types. And I mentioned household budget surveys such as the Living Costs and Food Survey. They pick up some differences between high and low income households and the spending patterns, but aren't sufficiently detailed to deal with the kind of issues that Jack Monroe was raising in her tweets. Increasingly, we're making use, and the ONS is making use of new sources of supermarket scanner data, which are taken from stores, and also web scrape data, which are highly detailed, but don't have the advantage that you can link these to the budget shares of different household types. So you can't see how important the different goods are for high and low income households, and what that means for their inflation experiences. So in this paper, we're going to try and bridge that gap. And we're doing it by using a very detailed transaction level source of data of households' grocery purchases, which we're going to use to study the extent and also get at some of the causes of inflation inequality during the cost of living crisis. To give you a preview of our findings, what we show is that this period was characterized by what is in recent times an unprecedented degree of inflation inequality. This inflation inequality is entirely driven by differences within category consumption baskets. So as I mentioned, it's not the fact that low and high income households spent different amounts on bread, and bread saw high or low price increases. It's within bread, low income households tended to buy cheaper varieties of bread, and it's those cheaper varieties that saw higher price inflation. This is all driven by larger price increases for cheaper goods, and we've adopted the same term that other people have used to describe this phenomenon, which is cheapflation. This led, perhaps unsurprisingly, to inequality in the changes in households' cost of living. And in the paper, we show that, and I'll discuss briefly how this result holds when you account for substitution, various biases that you have with fixed base indices, substitution effects, allowing for preference non-homothecities, and product entry and exit. We also wanted to understand a bit more about what might be driving this pattern of cheapflation, so these faster price increases for cheaper products. And the problem is with the recent cost of living episode is that there were a whole load of changes going on at once. There were commodity price shocks, there were changes in wages, there was changes in demand patterns. So we go back in time and we look at an earlier cost shock that's driven by the steep decline in sterling following the Brexit referendum, and see how that traces through to the prices of goods imported from the European Union. And there we see a similar pattern. So we see a similar pattern where this cost shock is disproportionately passed through to the prices of low-priced imports, which suggests that one of the causes of cheapflation is the fact that these cost shocks lead to firms increasing prices just in proportional terms higher at the lower end of the quality distribution. The data we're using is from the Kantar home scan microdata that tracks the consumption of a panel of UK households through time. It covers both offline and online purchases of what are known as fast-moving consumer goods. So this is what I previously referred to as grocery, alcohol, and household supplies. There we observe the barcode level expenditures on different items, the prices paid, and the attributes of the products people are buying. What we define as our product definition here is what we call brand size pair, which is or the barcode for fresh produce, which is so an individual brand, which might be Diet Coke, and then a size of the product. And the products are grouped into three different layers. So we've called the highest level segments. So that might be a product like dairy, a category of spending like dairy. Then within dairy, we've got categories. So that might include things like milk, yogurt, butter, and so on. And then within that, we have 90,000 products across those categories. So in the case of butter, that might be a brand like President Unsalted Butter of a weight of 250 grams. So extremely detailed data on product purchases. We're focusing on this 9-quarter period when inflation was most rapid. That's 2021 to 2023. And over that period, we have data for 19,000 continually recording households. And we compare that period to some earlier quarters of equivalent length, stretching back from 2012. When we're talking about rich versus poor households, we've got two different measures of household income. One is equivalized household expenditure, so household expenditure adjusted for family size, and the other is equivalized household income, which in this data is banded and top coded, and so less detailed than the expenditure definition. I'm going to be showing you results from the household expenditure definition today to document patterns of inflation and inequality, but these patterns are very similar when you look by income. To measure inflation for each household, what we're doing is we're using a Laspeyres index, also known as a fixed basket index. And what this is a share-weighted average of the price changes across different goods. And in our case, these budget shares are going to vary not only across time and product categories, but also across households. So we've got an age subscript there. We calculate this index for different households, and then we chain price changes across each period to account for changes in the basket. So in terms of the broad patterns we see in the data using this measure, in panel A, what we've got is the average inflation rate we see across households over the whole of this period. And remember, this data covers grocery products, so this is the inflation rate for grocery products. And the solid black line there shows the cumulative inflation rate in this most recent period, this cost of living crisis from 2021-2023. And you see rapid increases in food price inflation, very similar to what was measured in the CPI over this period. And in the more faded lines, dashed and dotted lines, that's the inflation rates for earlier periods. And you can obviously see this was a period of much higher price rises than any of those periods. In panel B, we also show that this period was also characterized by really high variance in the inflation rates, so high rates of dispersion in the inflation rates across households. So again, the solid black line is for the most recent period, and you can see that there's quite a wide dispersion of inflation rates different households experience around the mean, and that's much higher than in these earlier periods, represented by the dashed and dotted lines. As well as being a period of very high variation in households' inflation experiences, this diagram shows, or this graph shows, that there was also an unprecedented degree of inflation inequality, by which we mean differences in inflation rate across the expenditure distribution. So again, the black line is the differences in inflation rates across periods across the household expenditure distribution, and you can see households in the bottom fifth experienced inflation rates about 2.5 percentage points above the mean, whereas for households in the top fifth, it was around 2 percentage points, so a spread of about 4.5 percentage points. And this is very unusual for grocery purchases, at least. So when you compare it to these earlier periods, you see that they were not characterized by nearly the same degree of inflation inequality. So this wasn't just a period of high inflation, this is a period when higher income households saw much faster grocery price inflation than lower income households. Now we want to understand what's behind these differences in inflation inequality. And to do that, we exploit a property of the Lewis-Berries index, which is you can decompose it into a hierarchical index. So what we do is we take these three category product definitions we have, segments, categories, and products, and we calculate an inflation rate where households have the same budget share across so we calculate inflation rates where households have the full dispersion inflation rates. So we use budget shares at the individual project level. Excuse me, I'll start again. This is a hierarchical index, so you can write the inflation rate of total inflation is a Lewis-Berries index of goods at different layers of the product distribution definition of products. So it's more easily explained by a diagram. So the total index is a weighted sum of the segment level inflation indexes, which is a weighted sum of category level indexes, which is a weighted sum of product level price changes. So to understand what level of these things is driving inflation inequality, at each level we're going to replace the budget shares with the spending shares of the average household rather than the individual households. So we're shutting down heterogeneity in budget shares at either the category or segment level to understand which level is important for driving inflation differences. And this shows the results. So on the left-hand side, we've got the distribution of inflation rates. So and the black line is where we allow for the full level of heterogeneity in households' budget shares. And this is the same as the diagram I showed you before, showing the deviation in the mean and the high level of dispersion. What we've done in the red line is we've shut off variation in households' budget shares at the lowest level of aggregation. So you can see that dramatically reduces the amount of dispersion in household inflation rates. And the blue line, we then shut off dispersion in household inflation rates at all but the highest levels. So we're only allowing for variation in household spending by category level. And again, that narrows the distribution further. Perhaps more importantly, so what panel B shows is what that means for inflation inequality. So here we've got again, these hierarchical index where we shut down variation at different levels of aggregation. And you can see this pattern of inflation inequality, so this pattern of higher price rises for lower income households versus higher income households, is only apparent when we have this, when we allow for the full disaggregate definitions of products. So when we allow a product share variation at the level of things like that President butter, 250 grams. So to understand what role price differences across the across cheap versus expensive products play in this role, so the role of cheapflation, we're going to segment the product space that households are buying into a 10-rung quality ladder. So this is within category. We're going to take the cheapest products, the products in the lowest tenth of the price distribution. We're going to call them the lowest quality goods, and split the quality rung across 10. And so the 10th decile will be the highest quality goods, the goods with the highest initial prices. We have some issues with products that enter into the data set that we're using after the initial period. So for these ones, we have a predicted price for these products if they have the same inflation rate as the whole category, which we use to allocate them to different parts of the quality ladder. And the assumption here is that products with lower unit prices, or initially lower unit prices, within these narrowly defined categories, so within different types of butter, for example, are lower quality products. So panel A here shows the price changes by quality rung. So again, the solid black line is over the recent cost of living crisis. What we can see is the products at the cheaper end, so the lowest quality products, saw much faster price increases, over 30%, than the products at the highest quality end of the ladder. So at the more expensive end, where product prices rose by less than 20%. And again, this is very unusual. So we have the data from the previous 9 quarter periods below that, and you can see not only lower price changes, but also it doesn't have quite the steep gradient of price changes across the quality ladder. On panel B, we show that perhaps unsurprisingly, it's those households that are higher up the expenditure distribution that tend to buy these higher quality products, whereas households at the lower end of the expenditure distribution tend to spend more of their budgets on lower quality products. So, I mean, this is in a sense obvious, but it tells you that the more expensive goods are luxuries, and they're more important in the budget shares of these richer households, whereas poor households are much more likely to buy these cheaper products. And the bottom line of all of this is that this pattern of what we call cheapflation is really, therefore, very important for driving the patterns of inflation inequality. So all of this has been using the spares index, so a fixed basket, but this suffers from a number of well-known problems. The first is substitution effects. So we're assuming that people don't change their spending patterns as relative prices change substitute towards cheaper goods, which might mitigate some of the cost of living increase impact on them. There's other reasons why people might deviate from the fixed basket specified in the initial period. So in particular, we know that living standards were changing over this period. People were getting effectively poorer, so they might want to trade down towards cheaper products, which would also lead to changes in the consumption baskets. And there are new product varieties entering. So certain product lines disappear and new ones enter, and they might have different effects on different households depending on how important those product varieties were for them. So dealing with each of these issues in turn, the first way to deal with these kind of substitution effects is to switch away from the spares to use what's known as the superlative index. So in this one type of superlative index, which is the Tornquist index. So what this index is instead of the share-weighted arithmetic average of price changes, it's a geometric average of price changes. So you multiply all the price changes together, and you take the nth root, and each of these is weighted by an average of the budget shares in the starting period and at the ending period. And the fact you've got the ending period in there means it allows households to substitute away from goods that become relatively more expensive, and for that to lower the inflation rate that they would otherwise experience. So on panel A, it shows the Tornquist index across the expenditure distribution relative to the Lasperas index. And what you can see is that the Tornquist index is always lower than the Lasperas index because people are substituting away from these goods that saw faster price rises. But you can also see that the gradient for the Tornquist index is less steep, which means that it's these lower income households that seems to be doing more of this substituting than higher income households. And to make that super clear, we've got that in the second panel, the implied substitution bias, which is the difference between the blue and the red lines, which shows that the substitution bias is greater at the lower end of the expenditure distribution. Another issue we have to contend with, which is particularly important now we're using this Tornquist superlative index, is that people's preferences are likely to change as their income changes. So what this graph shows you again is that when it comes to the spending shares on the top rung of the distribution, it's those higher income households that spend more of their budgets on these things. And whereas for the lower income households, they spend more on the bottom rung of the distribution. And so what you would expect is that as people's incomes change, they're going to move along these curves. So households are becoming poorer might shift away from the top rung of the distribution and towards the bottom rung. So they might trade down, in other words. And in panel B, what this shows you is that this happens, so that within households, because we've got panel data, we can track households over time. Those households that saw the faster declines in their expenditure tended to see faster increases in their spending, their relative spending on the bottom rung of the quality distribution, and decreases in their spending on the top rung of the quality distribution. So to correct for this, we can use a method that was recently proposed in the work of Levell and Ashkari. They proposed an algorithm that adjusts the Tornquist index for preference non-homothenicities, using the fact that as households become poorer, we'd expect them to change their budget shares, not because they're substituting, but because they're trading down. And what this algorithm does is it comes up with an adjustment to offset, to unwind the impact of that. And what you can see is that this non-homotheticity correction means that inflation rates are lower than they would be with the standard Tornquist index. And that's because it's undoing the fact that as households get poorer, they're shifting down the quality ladder towards these goods that have seen faster price increases. And when you undo that effect, it means that to get the budget shares they would have if they'd had constant incomes, you're going to shift their basket towards goods that have lower inflation rates. So this has a meaningful but small impact on the measured inflation rate. And again, it matters across the expenditure distribution how large this bias is relative to the Tornquist index. So you can see the bias is higher for those higher income households than for lower income households. And that's because these households, perhaps because they had more scope to trade down, were more likely to reduce their spending to increase their spending on those higher inflation rungs of the quality ladder. So the final thing we wanted to do is to try and understand why this happened, or why we saw this pattern of cheapflation that led to this inflation inequality. And that's so that we can understand if this is something that was very specific to this period, or perhaps something that we might generally expect to happen when cost increases, firm cost increases, commodity prices are rising, and that's really pushing up inflation rates, whether we would expect that almost as a general rule to push up inflation rates for these low quality products, and therefore for low income consumers much more. So a possible explanation is that of cheapflation over this period is that over time, in this period when oil and gas prices were rising, firms faced increases in their costs. They passed those through to individual products, but they pass them proportionally at a higher rate for those cheaper products. And one scenario you can think about is, for example, if costs of firms are producing counter-baked beams rose by 1p, and they pushed up prices by 1p across the quality ladder, that's going to be a much larger proportional increase in prices at the lowest end of the quality distribution, and a much lower proportional increase in prices at the top end of the quality distribution. And indeed, if we look through history and through the literature on this topic, we find quite a lot of evidence for different proportional cost pass-through across products, which might suggest this is going on. So to understand whether this might be happening in our context, we look back to 2016, so we rewind, we look at an earlier period in the data, and we take a cost shock that's quite clean in the sense it's not contaminated by all the other things that were going on during the cost of living crisis. It's a sudden increase in the prices of certain goods versus others. And that's the 20% reduction in the pound-euro exchange rate that happened around the UK's vote to leave the European Union. So this is something that would affect the costs of importing or selling in pound terms EU imports. And so we're going to compare the price growth of EU imports to domestic goods, and we're going to split them according to, again, across the quality ladder. So looking at EU products that were initially cheaper and versus more expensive, and see if the price rises across those goods different. So this shows you the cost shock we're using. So panel A shows the exchange rate depreciation, which was very fast, very rapid, sudden and unexpected, and very persistent. And what panel B shows is the price changes for EU and domestic goods at different levels of the quality ladder. So in particular, the dashed lines are at the lower quality end, lower half of the quality ladder, and the solid lines are at the higher end of the quality ladder. And what you can see is that among those EU goods, EU imports, so these are products which are essentially fresh products for which we have country of origin in our data. It's those initially cheaper goods that saw much faster price increases in response to this exchange rate shock, much more than the more expensive varieties of EU goods. And this opened up a wedge in the prices paid for cheap versus expensive EU products that is not evident for the domestic goods, which weren't similarly affected by this cost shock. So this is further evidence that the proportional change in prices is higher at the lower end when firms experience these cost shocks. And that's a reason to expect this pattern of cheapflation to be more general at times of rapid inflation, which might, again, bias these measures of inflation inequality that doesn't use this very disaggregated data. So just to summarize what I've said, so we've been studying the 2021-2023 cost of living crisis that was characterized by an unprecedented degree of inflation inequality, at least in recent times. This inflation inequality was driven by quite a novel pattern of cheapflation, where we saw higher proportional price increases for low quality products, which more poorer households are naturally going to be more exposed to. A potential cause of this is differential pass-through of cost shocks across the quality ladder, which translates into the inequality in the costs of maintaining households' pre-inflationary shock living standards. And I think the big this is that Jack Monroe was correct in that it's important to account for these differences in very narrowly defined, in price changes across very narrowly defined products or categories. And this is going to be particularly important in times of rapid inflation, when this pattern of cheapflation might be more likely to arise. So that's the end of my slides. So I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. Really interesting. Now we have a discussant, Michael Hardie. Michael, are you there?
I'm here. Hi, Kevin.
Hello, Michael. Do you have some slides you're going to share? Can you?
Do have some slides, which hopefully should be on everyone's screen shortly. Can everyone see the?
Yeah, that's great.
Slide?
Thanks, Michael. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Hardie. So I'm Deputy Director for Prices Transformation Division at ONS. So I'm responsible for bringing in large admin data to improve the quality and granularity of our consumer price statistics. In a previous role, I was responsible for the production of consumer business and house price statistics. So, just an introduction. So the cost of living crisis has raised several questions around whether consumer price statistics are accurately capturing the inflation experience of different households, with a particular focus on low-income households. And we received a range of questions on this topic during the cost of living crisis. This brought more prominence to statistics such as the household cost indices. So we have our main macroeconomic measures of inflation, which are the Consumer Prices Index and Consumer Prices Index, including owner-occupiers housing costs. We have also recently started producing on a quarterly basis the household cost indices, which measure the changing costs and prices faced by different household groups. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail in my presentation. However, using microdata, which can link household attribute information to really detailed price information, which Peter's done in his research, I think can really deepen our understanding of how the rising cost of living has impacted different groups of people across UK society. So I'm not going to go into Peter's paper in a huge amount of detail because he's already given a very comprehensive presentation, but I've just picked out a few aspects of the paper which I found particularly interesting. I think it's the scale of the differences that jumped off the sheet to me. So in terms of households in the top income decile, the inflation that they experienced was 7.7 percentage points lower than those in the bottom income decile, which is a significant difference. And differences within product category are responsible for half of that inflation dispersion, which I thought was quite interesting. I really liked the quality ladder approach and the 10 rungs. Again, the scale of the differences jumped out at me here, where the bottom rung of the quality ladder experienced inflation of 34.2% compared with the top two rungs, which was 18.3%. So quite significant differences there. Also, households really allocating the spending to products at the top and bottom of the quality ladder, not only a response to increasing prices, but it's also an income effect there. And Peter's analysis around cheaper products bearing the brunt of a range of different shocks to the UK economy, and particularly the depreciation in sterling, which has fed through to those cheaper products. So I'm just going to cover very briefly some of the analysis that we did in the cost of living crisis to provide additional insights into what was driving UK inflation at that time. We're currently in the process of working towards using grocery scanner data in March next year. I'm then going to cover the household cost indices. I've introduced these new statistics, but Peter's focused solely on groceries prices. And I just wanted to look at if you were to look at the entire basket of goods and services that we use to calculate our headline measures of inflation. There are around 750 items. Does that narrative still hold? And then finally, I'll cover some areas of further research. So as I said, during the cost of living crisis, we received numerous questions on whether our headline measures of inflation were accurately reflecting the lived experience of many groups of people in UK society. And I drafted a blog measuring the change in prices and costs faced by households at the time to set out what our macroeconomic measures of inflation are designed to capture. And as Peter said, Jack Monroe, the journalist and activist, raised several concerns, and we had some really good discussions with Jack at the time around what our inflation measures are designed to capture and what they're not. The chart on the left-hand side of the screen is some analysis that we did at the time using web scrape data. So at this point in time, headline inflation was around 6%. And what we did was to scrape prices from the underlying HTML code of retailers' websites to look at how the prices had changed from 30 kind of everyday grocery items. So even though headline inflation was around 6% at the time, you can see from the chart that there are very big differences with some items experiencing extremely high inflation over that period. Also, we developed a price comparison tool, which is the top right kind of screenshot on the slide. So users could look at individual product and how prices have changed over time. And we also developed a personal inflation calculator as well. So users can go onto the ONS website and basically set out what they spend their money on during the month, and it will give you a personal rate of inflation, because our headline measure of inflation are averages, and everyone has their own individual personal rate of inflation. I just wanted to set a little bit of context as well in terms of how we collect our prices at the moment. So we have a range of different modes of collection, but one of the main modes of collection is sending price collectors out into stores across the UK, and they collect prices for individual products. But they make an assessment on what's the most kind of popular product, and they make that assessment based on kind of shelf space and also market knowledge as well. So it's worth bearing that in mind when I go through the rest of the analysis, because I think that's quite an important point when comparing some of ONS's statistics against the analysis that Peter's undertaken. As I said, we are working towards utilising grocery scanner data for 50% of the grocery market in March. So for the retailers that we'll be going live with, we currently collect around 25,000 prices for those retailers. We'll be replacing that collection with around 300 million price points derived from over the sales of 1 billion units of products per month. And that's data collected directly from supermarket scanners at checkouts. And that'll be included across our suite of consumer price statistics. So instead of collecting individual prices for each item in different retailers, for those retailers, we'll have a census of prices within the store. We'll also have those prices across the entire month. And importantly, we will have access as well to how much of each of those individual products have been purchased, which will allow us essentially for those retailers to have a dynamic basket that updates every month, which will capture a lot of the really detailed consumer spending changing patterns, which are being experienced, which we don't have the weight in order to do at the moment. What this will not allow us to do is link back to household attribute information, which Peter's been able to do in his analysis. So I wanted to move on to the household cost indices. As I said, these are designed to measure the changing costs and prices faced by different households. They can be broken down into different household groups. They're based on when a good or service is paid for rather than when it's acquired, which is consistent for most of the basket. But if you think of student loans, for example, you acquire your education services degree, for example, and then you would, if you had a student loan, pay for that over many years after acquiring that particular service. So they focus on when goods and services are paid for. And they also include mortgage interest payments as well. That's the approach we've taken for owner-occupiers housing costs. They have different baskets for different households, but we use the same price indices. So we will not be capturing within item preferences. So Peter gave an example in his presentation. If I give another, for bread and cereal, for example, if a lower income household spends a larger proportion of their income on bread and cereal, that will be captured. But if they make a decision to, for example, potentially buy a budget rather than a premium brand, that will not be captured. So that is one limitation of this work. On the slide, you have inflation by income decile, so second income decile, ninth income decile, and fifth. As you can see from the chart, up until around 2021, even a little bit further, you can see that inflation for these household groups match quite closely. And then over the cost of living period, you see that lower income households experience higher inflation compared with high income households. And then as inflation starts to ease, you actually see that higher income households experience higher inflation over that period. I think it's good to focus over the longer term. So if you look at the 4 years to December 2023, in terms of household costs, low income households experienced inflation of 25% and high income households 24.5%. So inflation is very similar over that period for high and low income households, but we do see some differences depending on period analysed. I'm just going to dig into this in a little bit more detail now. So the chart that you can see on the slide kind of breaks down the differences between low and high income households. So when the line's above the x-axis, that's when inflation is higher for low-income households. You can see over the cost of living crisis, the bar is above the line. So low-income households are experiencing higher inflation. And then in more recent periods, high-income households are experiencing higher inflation. So the pale blue bars analyze food and non-alcoholic beverages. As you can see, this supports Peter's work that low-income households are experiencing a much bigger impact from the rising costs of food and non-alcoholic beverages. But a really important area of the basket during this period was Division 4, which is housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels. So during the cost of living kind of period from 2022 onwards, you can see that in addition to food prices, we've also got low-income households experiencing higher inflation, and that's driven by this category, which I'll break down a little bit more in the next slide. And then in more recent periods, that same category is actually resulting in higher inflation for high-income households. So although food is a key part of the puzzle, and Peter's research supports that, there are other factors, particularly Division 4, that having an impact on the differences in inflation across household groups. So breaking down that Division 4 in a bit more detail, there's two main things at play here. During that cost of living period, got high energy prices, and low-income households spend a larger proportion of their income on energy. So that's having a bigger impact on that particular group. Pulling in the other direction in terms of putting more pressure on high-income households, you also have owner-occupiers housing costs. So mortgage interest payments here are having a large impact, and that's generally because high-income households are more likely to be paying a mortgage compared to low-income households. Energy also plays a role here. Following the large increases in energy, in 22 and 23, they fall then following this period. So that's actually having a higher impact on high-income households, because low-income households are benefiting from the fact that prices are falling over that period, and they spend a larger proportion of their income on energy. So we have started thinking about how we can improve our statistics like the household cost indices, and the University of Strathclyde commissioned to do some work for us to look into what more we can do to improve those statistics. So this is a piece of research led by Dr. Hannah Randolph. So the first is to purchase commercial household scanner data. So that's exactly what Peter's used for his study, to get that level of granularity that would pick up consumer preferences within items that you simply can't pick up with the level of weighting that we currently do within the household cost indices. I think one thing that we're extremely keen to do in the medium to longer term is that we have scanner data at the moment, but loyalty card data would allow us to link that scanner data to household attribute information. In early discussions with the retailers, they were less keen to give us loyalty card data because obviously that's personal information to their customers. And at the moment, the scanner data basically gives us a breakdown of every product that a retailer sells within a store and how much of that product has been purchased. You can't link it to household attribute information. Other areas that were suggested is to update the living cost and food survey. So this is the main source of expenditure information that we use for consumer price statistics, to ensure that it's more granular, so we can utilize those weights at a lower level, or use a periodic or one-off study to get a better understanding of the dispersion in household groups' inflation rates relative to the household cost indices, which then could be used by those statistics. So those are a range of areas of research that we could focus on moving forward. And Peter's research has already kind of utilized the commercial household scanner data to great effect in his research. Thank you. That's all I wanted to cover.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. Peter, do you have any immediate responses to Michael's comments?
I don't think so. I'm happy to go straight to questions.
Okay, well, it's great to see all the work that the ONS is doing there. Okay, we've got some questions in the Q&A, and if you do have some questions, please do put them in the Q&A, and I'll try to get to them. The first question is from Simon Van Norden. He's asking about inflation expectations. There's been some work in the US saying that the COVID period was rather unusual, and you had two groups, one group with anchored expectations and another group with unanchored inflation expectations. Peter, are you aware of any work linking cheapflation to differences in inflation expectations across groups?
I'm not, but I think this is a certainly important application of this kind of work, or at least just to understand how inexperienced inflation feeds through into people's inflation expectations across different types of households, and then how that feeds through into wage demands, and then how that should dictate monetary policy. At the moment, everything is sort of depends on the kind of headline CPI rate and expectations with regard to the headline CPI rate. But ultimately, it's kind of the cost of living people face and the cost pressures people are under that is going to kind of determine, how they're planning and preparing for future price increases. So I think, just to say that this is a very important topic, just understanding how inflation inequality, how that matters for broader policy making, including monetary policy making. That's a really important area of research.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Paul Smith asks about how costs are passed through. He thinks it looks like firms have a definite strategy of passing more costs through to lower priced items, even if their own costs are more evenly spread across products. Do you think there's something to that?
So in general, it's these kind of cheaper products that tend to have lower markups, lower margins. So the supermarkets make their money from the margins they achieve from the premium products. And so one explanation for what's going on is just that the margin is thin for these for these products lower down the quality ladder. So when costs increase, there's less kind of scope for the firm to absorb some of that cost in its margins and markups before it passes them through to the consumer. So I think what's likely to be happening is that there's less cost sharing going on, and that as a result, that's what means that it's the cheaper products that really see the fastest price increases, in proportional terms. And this is kind of consistent with when we see pass-through of exchange rate shocks in other contexts. It's not complete, so there's incomplete pass-through by firms. So there is some cost sharing going on, but yeah, obviously there's kind of less scope to do that if the margins are smaller in the first place.
Great, thanks, Peter. Liam Greenhow asks about unit values. Did you account for product weight differences in some way?
Yes, so when we're talking about prices, these are all prices per unit, so per gram or per milliliter, or depending on the volume of how things are defined. So this is accounting for size. So implicit in that question might be a concern about what's known as shrinkflation, which is when products, rather than changing price, they change in quality or size in some other dimension, and so you can buy a packet of oranges, the price doesn't change, but you get fewer oranges in the pack. So that's the kind of really interesting thing. I mean, we found it difficult to study it in the current paper because it's quite difficult to know what's a shrinkflated product and what's a new product. But that's a kind of, another interesting question I think for future research, is to understand how much shrinkflation is going on and how that affects different types of households. For example, a larger household that might buy things in bulk might be more affected than a smaller household buys individual items.
Right. A question from Nick Alton. What is the economic mechanism at work here? Is supply P of low-cost products particularly inelastic, for low-cost products particularly inelastic, so that prices rise sharply as expenditure shifts to cheaper products? If so, why?
Yes, so yeah, you can sort of imagine. Yes, it's I mean, ultimately, firms will pass through costs only if they can get away with them, and this depends on the market elasticities of demand, but also on the nature of competition in the market and a whole load of things to do with market structure. Again, that's not something that we've been able to look into in this particular paper, but yes, that's the kind of it's a question that gets at the heart of, is this the kind of general thing that we would expect to happen in all circumstances, or only in certain circumstances where, depending on the market structure or the type of cost increases or which firms are affected and things like that. But yes, I think it's a good question, but we don't have a good answer for the market elasticities and how they determine the pass-through.
Okay, a question from Ben Hillman. Were other measures than income and expenditure considered, measures such as deprivation?
We don't. At least I don't think we have good measures of deprivation in the survey we're using. Exactly. Our measures of living standards are either household expenditure or household income, which we can equivalize for household size. But I don't think we have kind of measures of material deprivation that you could also use. And in fact, it's quite difficult to find measures of those that are kind of linked to the budget data that you need to do analysis of inflation inequality.
Okay, and I think we've got time to take one more question, and question here by Alan Evans, which I think might help nicely summarize things. Was there anything in the studies that surprised you?
Was there something in that studies that surprised me? That's a good question. I have to kind of think back to when we started and what our expectations were. I mean, I suppose what was kind of surprising was, different things would have been surprising to different authors depending on the kind of experience with this kind of data. At least what was surprising to me is that I think there's a perception that that cheapflation is kind of always rampant. This is always an issue, that there's always inflation inequality, and that there's always kind of and that there's been a systematic thing for the last 10 years. What our data shows is that this period, it became very relevant in this current period when price rises were going up really rapidly. And that's one of the things that made this period historically unusual. So I guess I was surprised by how unprecedented all these patterns were, and how unusual the cost of living crisis was in terms of the patterns of inflation and inequality we saw.
Great, thanks very much, Peter. And we're exactly on time, so apologies to the people who put in questions in the Q&A and we didn't get around to them. I'm sure Peter would be delighted to receive your questions. Please just email him, and I'm sure he'll respond in due course. Thank you very much, Peter, for this really interesting piece of research. Thank you also, Michael, for your work as discussant. Really interesting stuff about what the ONS is doing with, particularly with scanner data. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Bye for now. See you next time.
Thanks very much.